I'm live, I just had a failed attempt. I'm reading Vague Vacation by Joan Marshall Grant. I'm in chapter 14. It is her journey through France, published in 1946. And this one is entitled Formal Call. For long enough it had been Charles' first thought on waking that there was a great deal to be done, and he must immediately begin to do it. This morning he had a letter from Sue, my niece, and our secretary, which casually mentioned that one of our guests had fallen downstairs because the passage light had fused. Immediately he became convinced that his electric plant had died of maltreatment and that we should never be able to replace it. Then we can use candles, I said, and anyway, if you've got to worry, why not about poor Tilly? Sue says she's been x-rayed and there's nothing wrong except bruises. The engine is far more serious. Candles, I said again, and allow the house to burn down. As most of it has survived 400 years, it will probably last until we get home. Think how annoyed you would be if I started to fuss about Gillian. I know she's magnificently competent, but she's only 16, and we've landed her with the housekeeping. As Gillian is your daughter, the sooner she learns to look after quantities of guests, the better, for it is already clear that she has inherited your overdeveloped sense of hospitality. Read the letter again and see if you can extract another disaster. Perhaps the brokers have arrived and are sitting in your study lighting cigars with your favorite diagrams. Or has Sue allowed the stamp account to go septic? Or plunged your bionomic research unit into disrepute by sending vulgar picture postcards to professors? I will go to check over the car, he said with dignity, and I refrained from commenting that it was unlikely to have collapsed during the night. I followed him after a decent interval, and on the way to the garage at the other side of the yard met a young man who was pressing grapes from the Blanc small vineyard. He had been a prisoner of war in Germany and said he had been treated neither better nor worse than the others. I was near Berlin most of the time. He bent down to sweep his hands across the dust. Berlin is like that, flat, nothing. Most of the time I was working in the fields near a railway. When the RAF shot up the trains, we went on working within 200 yards, and the German guards pretended nothing was happening. He grinned. But when other aeroplanes came over, we took to the ditches. He interlaced his fingers. Churchill was right when he said France and England should be like this. We are both old countries. We understand each other. I should have preferred to ask more questions, but realized that the grapes demanded his attention. As I stepped out of the light into the shadow of the huge shed, which was used as a garage, I could see his sinewed, almost coppery arms strain at the bar of the press, and the purple juice stream out between the staves. Charles was not at the car, so I went on through the garage into the walled garden. The soil was so light and sandy that it was surprising anything survived a drought. Yet the beds were filled with vegetables, and there was a long herbaceous border ending in a rose-covered arbor. At far end of the garden, the backsides of a man and a boy were conspicuous among the spinach. As I drew closer, the larger of the two became familiar. It belonged to Charles, who was picking for his dinner. Remembering the chateau near Roche-Vineuse and the signs indicating sellers of the local vineyards, we decided to spend the evening exploring. The chateau was on the chateau was on a spur high above the main road, and we found a lane which led in the right direction. From tentative inquiries, I was convinced that it was uninhabited and open to visitors who asked permission from the caretaker. To which chateau this information really applied, we never discovered. The lane grew increasingly steep and stony, so we left the car and continued on foot under towering walls which must have been at least 50 feet high and had no openings except arrow slits between the massive round towers. It must have been virtually impregnable in its own time. and would have been a perfect setting for a Dawnford Yeats adventure. The wall led us to the top of the steep, where we found that a long avenue, level as a pavement, followed the ridge from what must have been the proper road of approach to the massive iron gates. The chateau was definitely not a ruin, and I became less convinced that it was open to the public, which made me still more eager to see it. A woman stared at us from the little garden, part of the battlement walk, which was level with the upper windows of the gatehouse. We asked her if it was permitted to enter the garden, perhaps even to see inside the chateau. She said that Madame la Marquise was in residence, that for permission we must ask at the house. I walked determinedly forward through a small formal garden, bounded on the west by a balustrade, which showed an immense panorama of hills and mountains. Charles followed me reluctantly, and while I was still trying to formulate an opening sentence, which would convince the owner that we were not tourists, but sympathetic people whom she would instantly recognize as friends, he began to protest. I refuse to call on complete strangers. If you must pay formal calls, for heaven's sake, warn me, so that we can both be properly dressed and arrive in the car by the road instead of clambering up the hill like a couple of oafs. The cherished vision of a warm and understanding reception began to wilt. My French would probably dry up, as it is apt to do when I feel embarrassed. We might be snubbed, and Charles would be furious with me. I wished fervently that I had been a little less precipitate, but there was still a chance to save the situation, providing I could clutch at the last shreds of my self-confidence. I hesitated and realized it was too late to go back, for a chef was peering at us from a lower window. We shall have to call, I said, still pretending that I took it as the most natural thing in the world that we should walk up and introduce ourselves. Charles, I think, would even then have retreated, but I found both his card and my own in my bag, and thus armed with at least some slender evidence of respectability, I peeled at the long black knob of the bell and heard the echoes clamour through the house. The door stood open because of the heat and disclosed a long and beautifully kept passage, hung with blue-green tapestries. We waited. Charles shuffled and kicked gravel on and off the lowest step. No one answered the bell. We waited in all, I suppose, not more than 3 or 4 minutes, but this time seemed long, and Charles, when he is going to explode from irritation, does so with extreme rapidity. He exploded. "I'm damned," he remarked quietly but unmistakably, "if I'm going to hang around all afternoon to be stared at. I'm in shirt sleeves. I'm evidently a tripper. They are no doubt going to let the dogs loose. We deserve it." He turned, the gravel crisp under his heel, and stalked off towards the gatehouse, without another word, leaving me standing like a monument at the door. At that moment, a trim maid, her hands still busy at the knot of the apron strings, came hurrying from the other side of the courtyard. Thank heavens she was not making for the front door, or no decent retreat would have been possible. Though we were... I think the battery is too empty. I think it finished at "thank heaven she was not making for the front door, or no decent retreat would have been possible." Though we were within the hours of calling, probably in France, as in England, the caller is so rare that even in the largest houses no standing provision is made for his reception. I stepped quickly inside the door, dropped our cards on the tray, and departed in the wake of my husband with as much dignity as fast pace would allow. I did not catch him up until I reached the car, and in silence he let in the clutch. "We will go now," he said sententiously, "to a place where they are not constrained by the conventions of departed grandeur, where even shirt sleeves may be tolerated, and if ever you land me with a formal call again and I'm not properly dressed, I'll have your hide." "Have a cigarette," I said, and I quite agree. I made a poop. Let us seek cool cellars. We took a side road leading to Verzy. The vintage was evidently in full swing. Calves, both ox-drawn and horse-drawn, were frequent, and there were parties of grape pickers only just visible among the upstanding green. Here the vines were mostly dressed high, and an army could have hidden in one of the larger vineyards, but there was no indication of cellars. So I think I finished this here because my battery is getting empty.